Okay, good.
Okay.
This being 2023, you all know what this means. And we're now in session. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're going to be speaking in English. In case there are questions in Spanish later, we'll just do a quick translation just to make sure that everybody who's following online can follow, but feel free to just use the language you prefer. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pierre Larsen. I'm the Associate Director of the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute. And I'm really happy to be welcoming tonight our two speakers. This is quite a special event. Louder. This is quite a special event for us because this is the first semester that we are welcoming a Threatened Scholar Fellow as part of this new program that was created with the support of the Mellon Foundation. So for the next 3 years, we will be welcoming 3 fellows every year. Each will stay for at City College for 1 semester to basically continue doing their work in a safe or at least non-threatening environment for them. We thought about this fellowship as a time that they can maybe take a step back from their context, where sometimes it can be a little difficult to just focus on your intellectual work. So this is really the idea behind this this fellowship. So tonight we have our first fellow in our first cohort of this new program, Ruth Pion. She was selected after, I have to say, a quite competitive round of applications. We were a little surprised. We were not expecting to receive as many applications. So it was a little difficult because I think that on the way we left aside some really good applications. But well, such was the procedure we had to follow, right? We only had 3 fellowships to give for this year. So just a few words about Ruth. I'm pretty sure most of you know her, but just in case, Ruth is a social researcher and a self-defined anti-racist and decolonial activist. She is from the Dominican Republic. She's particularly interested in the history of Black people, and this is reflected in her work as a founder and CEO of Afrohistoria RD. This is a project that she will be speaking at length, I think, about tonight. She's also the co-founder of the collective Junta de Prietos, and she has collaborated in the elaboration of una guía para la formación en perspectiva antirracista. As a scholar, Ruth has a degree in anthropology from the Autonomous University of Santo Domingo.
Almost.
Almost. And a degree in gender equality for University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. And she has worked on several archaeological projects in the Dominican Republic about the history of slavery in the country. And this fall, she is our inaugural fellow.
Thank you.
And before I let you speak, I just want to introduce Gina quickly. So Gina is a multidisciplinary artist, an educator, and a self-proclaimed messiah, as your online biography says. So their artistic work spans a wide range of disciplines and materials, including embroidery, installations, performance, ink drawings, with roots in the DR and in New York. They have participated in residencies and fellowships at SMAC Mellon, at the Laundromat Project, the Bronx Museum of Arts, just to name a few. And they have exhibited in the US and the Dominican Republic. Gina had also a research fellowship from the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute. So we have a little bit of history with them as well. And currently they are a doctoral student in the Department of Performing and Media Arts at Cornell University in Ithaca. And right now, I'm going to let
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for devoting a little bit of your time to share this space with us and discuss on intellectual freedom and freedom of speech in public spaces, particularly in democratic states. There's a lot of questions and there's a lot of threads that we could pull to talk about these subjects. Gina and I have decided to cover a little bit of how intellectual freedom and freedom of speech functions in real life in the Dominican Republic and also the diaspora. So I'm going to begin talking based on my experience, my studies, and my work as an activist in the Dominican Republic in the last 5 years to a decade, how things have been developing in the country. Very thankful, Pierre, for the kind introduction. Thank you so much. And again, thank you all for coming and joining us tonight, and to everybody that's via Zoom right now. So let's start by defining, so we're clear, what do we mean by intellectual freedom as opposed to academic freedom, which is a term, concept that has been thrown around a lot in the past few years here in the US and in other latitudes of the world. The work that I'm doing right now in City College is to actually build a syllabus on academic freedom and public scholarship. So I've been diving into these discipline, you could say. And the basic or more prominent difference between intellectual freedom and academic freedom is context and reach. So academic freedom happens within the scope of a higher education establishment or institution, and it applies to the subjects that interact in an academic setting more precisely. So students, researchers, scholars, teachers, administrations, etc. They all have a role to play for academic freedom to work, but intellectual freedom transcends academic spaces. And it is developed in a much more public sphere. And it is not only academically legitimized content that is promoted through or is spoken about through academic freedom, through intellectual freedom. So we're going to have the work of artists, the work of different thinkers, be coming from academic settings or not. So we have also community, in intellectual freedom, there's space for community voices as well. And freedom of speech then, so that's a protected right in most of the constitutions of the free democratic states of the modern world, right? So how does intellectual freedom express itself and freedom of speech in public spaces, particularly in the Dominican Republic? And we can start by describing the amount of access and the amount of permission or freedom that people have to engage in public dialogue, that engage in public displays and express their thoughts, their ideas. I would say in the Dominican Republic, we're leaning towards an institutional gag of intellectual freedom. And we're gonna go through examples to understand why I'm coming from when I'm saying this as a person that has been in academic spaces, that has produced research in the Dominican Republic, but also as an activist and a person that expresses her non-agreements. Sorry if I miss my words in English a little bit. We're gonna navigate, or we can do Spanglish as well. So as a person that expresses dissent, it has been very challenging to be out in the open about our ideas, and considering that intellectual freedom is not only people defending human rights as from activist spaces. Intellectual freedom also has to do with the intellectual production, artistic production of the people that is presented and is displayed or disseminated in public spaces. So first, to give a little context and to sustain intellectual freedom and freedom of speech, we must address the legal framework in the Dominican Republic. I mean, we could and we cannot, because laws, as we say, as we know, laws are good in principle, and laws, some of them are not good, but there are these principles in paper that sustain or that try to sustain harmony in society, but it doesn't mean that if it's written in paper, it happens in real life, and that's what we're diving into. But just for context, intellectual freedom and freedom of speech are protected under the Dominican Constitution in the Article 49. And we also have a law, Ley de Expresión y Difusión de Pensamiento, is law number 6132, that contains us, that gives us that legal backup, that legal framework to defend our right to express ourselves publicly without fear of punishments or censorship. But it's not the case of what's happening in the DR lately. So I'm talking about a gag effect in the Dominican Republic, and I think we could trace it to our education system. In order to articulate ideas and in order to produce knowledge, we have to be prepared to think critically. And critical thinking is something that sadly is not heavily promoted in the Dominican Republic, both in private and public academic institutions. Dominican economy is based in service, and hence the majority of students, of higher education students that have the privilege to access higher education, will more often than not go towards careers that can provide sustenance, that can provide livelihood. And those careers are not often are leadership, not often require a lot of scientific or critical thinking, although we're trying to, there's an expansion on that. So there's more opportunities in the sciences, in the STEMs, in the DR, but it doesn't mean that everybody has equal access to that. So we could speak on the quality of education to teach us and strengthen our critical thinking, which there's a huge lack of in the Dominican Republic as a whole. But then we could also talk about access to higher education. These institutions that could lead young people to think more critically, become leaders, change the paradigm in the DR are seldomly easy to access due to high prices and tuition fees. And the class divide is real also in the Dominican Republic. So more often than not, students are going to choose safe or things or careers that we think that are safe or prestigious. But then when they go to the professional practice, the scope of how much they can influence in the institutions where they get to work, if and when they get employment, is rather limited. So after education, we could say also employment. If and when these students access these institutional spaces in order to work and make a living, there's certain expectation that whoever it is in X, Y, or Z role is going to align with the political party of the moment. So there's a lot of tension in private institutions, in private employment, in private firms, but also in the public institutions, that you should not say that, because we don't say that here. And me, myself, I have been subjected to that personally. This is why I say that this comes from personal experience in my personal work. Of course, I had the privilege of not letting these expectations silence me and my principles, but a lot of Dominicans cannot do that in the island because they depend on this paycheck. And so we find ourselves backed against the wall, and sometimes too tired, too exploited to even try and think critically. We're too busy trying to get by. So this institutional gag is what makes people, whenever they get a government job, you cannot engage in zero kinds of political actioning that dissents from the government, because that could probably bring consequences to you. So there's a lot of fear of loss of employment. And I think that also works as a gap for people to express themselves publicly and engage in public actions against the government, for example, or criticizing the government, or criticizing other institutions. Please let me know when I'm when I'm going over time. I'm good. Okay, good. All right. So some examples of when and how I believe intellectual freedom has been violated, and also freedom of speech, reminding you that these concepts in the law also serve to protect freedom of cult, the freedom of practicing your faith, the freedom of putting your artistic work out there for other people to consume, for other people to see, and the right to express your discontent or any kinds of disagreements with the status quo. The first example that I want to give happened during the International Book Fair last year. A dear friend and colleague of ours, Ana Belique, was publishing a children's book to help children learn Creole, Haitian Creole. This book was going to be presented in the International Book Fair, but third parties, this activity was planned, was allowed, was put in the program, but a third party group erupted and started making threats and publicly announcing that they were going to go to the event and not allow the book to be presented because they're not going to let haitianización happen, because there's a huge fear of haitianización in the Dominican Republic that we could devote an entire talk just to talk about that. Yes, just to talk about that. So Ana Belique, that produced a book, a children's book, was forbidden from presenting her work in a public space, which is the International Book Fair. And this could talk about how institutions, the action or lack of action of the institutions and the state can allow situations like that to happen. Because at the end of the day, the book was not presented. Then we have this is a silencio a voces, right? It's a secreto a voces, right? Like the complicities of the state and the Catholic Church in the Dominican Republic, the heavy influence that Catholic and evangelical churches pull in the political space in the Dominican Republic, and how that has caused the violation of several rights. For example, the persecution against Gaga in La República Dominicana. Gaga is an ancestral Dominican practice, is a spiritual and cultural practice sustained by our Afro communities for many, 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 many years back. And out of a sudden, there has been a surge of a persecution against Gaga practitioners in San Pedro de Macorís, but also other latitudes of the island, where the mayor also participated and also took part. So these are things that are not only in the imaginary of the public, but it's something that our decision makers have in their heads as well. These biases, these ways of thinking that censor expressions other than or Eurocentric traditional practices, such as Catholicism as a faith, which is not a bad faith to have. Is the only one that's allowed to function, aside with the Christian evangelicals as well, and the heavy influence that this has, but also what is permitted and what is not. Because in one hand, Gaga celebrations were threatened in this past few years, but when the evangelical people organized against the order of the Ministry of Education to incorporate gender perspective, the gender perspective order, the integration of gender perspective order was gagged. So there's also this negotiation which groups have more influence on the state, like what the state procures and what the state, who the state listens to whenever people are expressing their discontent. May I add, my thesis, my master's thesis was basically in gender policies in the education system. So this order was they tried to incorporate gender perspective in 2019 officially, as it mandates by international law and national laws that promote gender equality. So this is not something that was sprung on the people, and there was a lot of dialogue and a lot of time and a lot of laws and policies that were put in place so they could allow this to happen, to integrate gender perspective in our in primary and secondary education. And what ended up happening is that when this group started putting pressure on the government, the order ceased. All right, 5 minutes. All right, so what's the role of the media? How the media talks about the issues, how the media talks about the groups that dissent, that express their, that they don't see the measurements that the state has taken regarding immigration, regarding the treatment of our Dominicans, brothers and sisters of Haitian descent, or Haitian immigrants in the Dominican Republic, and Black people in general in Dominican Republic. So how the media portrays these groups and how that influences public opinion, or the censorship of public opinion about it. And we have a lot of examples about this with the Antigua Orden Dominicana attacks on activists and organizers. They've been doing this for years, in something that I could only call as accomplices, like with the allowance of the state to do so, because during the protests in solidarity with George Floyd, the groups, alt nationalist fascist groups, showed up. This was a peaceful protest. We were literally going to bring flowers, bring our signs, and just say some words about George Floyd and our support of the African-American community in the US against police brutality and racism. That was it. A group of more or less 15 to 20 people or less, and over 40 alt-right nationalists along with police forces showed up. The people that started being aggressive and assaulting demonstrators were the fascist groups that showed up. And the police didn't protect us against them, the other way around. The police detained 2 of our friends and colleagues, and the other group was practically unscathed and this is also a dispute on public space, because they were upset because we were doing this manifestation in the vicinity of Independence Park that has a lot of significance, a lot of historical and cultural significance for Dominican people. Supposedly. We also have the attacks on 12th of October last year, on the yearly demonstration against colonization, and this is a thing that happens every year, and it's also an artistic demonstration. We have artists from the Dominican Republic and from the diaspora that demonstrate during this act every year. Well, last year, an alt-right nationalist group with the participation of Antigua Orden Dominicana showed up and literally beat up demonstrators. And I'm talking about older people and women. To not abund much more on this, let me just add the latest act of censorship in the Dominican Republic was for Palestine solidarity with Palestine a few weeks back. Again, alt-right nationalist groups showed up and beat up the demonstrators that were there, expressing their opinion, expressing their thoughts publicly, also in El Parque Independencia. So the space is also is very disputed, right? In a society as the Dominican people that have democratic principles, is a democratic society, but how much can we say that we are when the government, the state, is not, by their action or inaction, is supporting actions of censorship by third parties or through their own neglect. So as long as these principles of expressing ourselves publicly are not applied equally to everybody, can we say that we actually live in a democratic society? And let's leave it.
Maybe if I can interject before Gina shares her thoughts, would you like to maybe share some of also of your experiences with
Sure.
the with your own experience as a guide? I remember that you shared that experience when you
Applied.
arrived here and when you applied. And I think that that was also quite significant of the limitations on both the use of freedom of speech, but also the use of public space.
Of course. So, as you already know, I am the founder of Afrohistoria RD, which is an initiative to basically teach Black history in the Dominican Republic. I've always been interested in history and archaeology. I noticed in my experience as a student, also like even in higher education, but also as a researcher with 5 years of experience in a research institute of the Ministry of Education, the big chunks of information that are missing from our textbooks and the lack of focus on the identity or racial identity as Afro-descendant people in a society, in a country that's 82% plus Afro-descendants. So I realized that when the state doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then we as citizens must answer. And that this, in many cases, in my experience, if we don't do it, nobody will do it for us. So I started thinking when I finally decided to leave my very safe job at the Ministry of Education, not actually the ministry, an adjunct institute of evaluation and research of quality of education, where I learned a lot. And where I developed research project also on cultural heritage and how it is transmitted in our high school curriculum. When I decided to walk away from that job, I started thinking, what can I use? What resources do I have that I could use to further this mission of letting everybody know and teaching the Dominican kids, the Dominican young people that are mostly Afro-descendant kids that are being subjected to discrimination and racial profiling every day in our country. And they feel like that's just life. But that's the thing, it's not just life. Mm-hmm. These ways of seeing each other and relating to each other are historically constructed and politically reinforced. Mm-hmm. So I created Afrohistoria because if we don't know that this began at some point in history, we will never imagine another way of life. We will never imagine a point where this will no longer be the way that we treat Afro-descendant and Black dark-skinned people in Dominican Republic. So I studied several languages and I was not using none of them. So I needed to make a living as an adult since I was walking away from a very well-earned paycheck in the Ministry of Education or IDEICE, the institution where I worked. So I put all of that together, and my interest and also my commitment to my community that's Afro-descendant people of the Dominican Republic, and more particularly Black women in the Dominican Republic. So what could I put together that encompassed my experience and resources as a researcher, as a person that could speak many languages and that likes to be outside, because being in an office 8 hours a day, I don't know how you guys do it. I couldn't take more of that. And it has been one of the best decisions that I've made. So Afrohistoria began as a tour of the colonial city of Santo Domingo, which is famously known as the first official European settlement in the New World, but it's not known as the first place where African people were introduced in the New World, and the place where racial enslavement began in the New World. So what I do is in this public space, organize recorrido, a tour, where people would visit places that are not shown in traditional tours. That brings a perspective that is also not shown in traditional tours. So what we do is we speak about the experiences of the enslaved people. If you've ever been in Zona Colonial, you would know that the main focus of Zona Colonial is what the colonizers did. So, and in this house live fulano, and this was Viuda Mengano, and this is el Estatua de Colón. And that's all we get. That's all we get. As if Africans were not forced to build Zona Colonial. As if they never even stepped foot on it. That's one of the first questions that I asked during the tour. Like, look around, try to identify anything from African descent. And people cannot. Because the idea was not portraying this culture. But the sad thing is that the same way that African experiences were silenced during the time of the colonization, we have dragged that to our days. Although as an Afro-descendant society, we mainly live as Afro-descendant people. Or food or culture is heavily rooted in Afro-descendants. So I started guiding these tours, and a lot of people didn't like it, because talking about Africanidad in Dominican Republic equates saying that we're Black, and that is a direct threat to our imaginary connection to Hispanidad. So Hispanidad is what, to many Dominicans, is what brings us the most value. And when we say, no, pero nosotros somos afrodescendientes, people be like, I'm Dominican. You know, I'm Dominican. I know Black. I'm Dominican. So there's a lot of challenges there. And this summer, when I was conducting one of my tours, I also connect all this historical baggage with the Dominican current situation, because nothing happens in a void. So I connect all of this with the situation, for example, of the Haitian immigrants, the denationalization, La Sentencia 168-13, in which the Dominican state revoked nationality of people from Haitian descent, at least disproportionately affects people from Haitian descent and not other people. And so I address this as a connection, as a continuum of this way of dealing with each other in the Dominican Republic. And I was recorded while I was talking about this. I was asked a question, actually, when I was being recorded, but I always address this, whether I'm asked the question or not. So when I answered this question and I started connecting these dots, because for Dominicans, since we're not racialized as Black in our minds anymore, for us, we deflect our Blackness to Haitians, and we try to maintain that distance from Haitians. This is not to say that Dominicans and Haitians don't coexist. We work together, we live together, and there's a lot of families, and there's a lot of cross collaboration. But I'm talking about, in the political scope of things, and also in a heavy part of our imaginary is completely anti-Haitian. Mm-hmm. Many times our identity is defined by anti-Haitianism. Like, what are Dominicans? Well, not Haitians, anything but Haitians. So when this video was put online of me talking about these issues, the issues of los cañeros that have been denied their pensions, and other situations like the indiscriminate deportation of pregnant women and minors in the Dominican Republic to Haiti, although that's forbidden by law, it's not on our migratory laws, this made the news. So this person that published this video then took it to a local news channel. That brings us also to the media, and the media very irresponsibly, without talking to me, without confirming my identity, without asking me what I was doing, what was happening, they released a news flash about supuesta guía turística acabando con la República Dominicana. Because we have a problem with the truth. We have a problem with the truth, and we cannot accept criticism as a country. Criticism is a no-no. You must abide by, we must only show el sol, la playa, un tro de vaina, and más nada. So this is very critical. So that unleashed a wave of hate mail, death threats, My family don't want me in the country anymore, but they're not gonna get that. And there's a lot of fear, but also a lot of bravery. I'm not the first one, and I'm not the last one that this has been done to. These defamatory campaigns, these harassments, these slandering. It is strategy of these alt-right nationalist fascist groups to deter us from speaking our truth. They're not gonna get it. No, they're not going to achieve it. But this is why I'm here. And I think the main reason why when I applied, I extensively talked about my situation of risk. It was prior to this. It was before, when I applied, it was before this entire thing blew up on social media. Because as an activist, I'm considered pro-Haitian. We are collectively targeted. In this summer, I was individually targeted, which is something also that they do. So I'm not the first one that this happens to. I haven't been the last one either. Just last week, we have one of our queer feminist activists that collaborates with us, also slandered on social media. And the effect that this has on our mental health is significant. So where's the state when this happens to us? Because Antigua Orden Dominicana has been profusely denounced. There are some of our compañeras with the means and the privilege of being able to pursue legal cases. We have not received satisfactory answers. So until when this impunity is going to continue? Until assault moves to murder? Is that enough?
Thanks for sharing. Dina?
Yeah, I don't know. I want to sit with that. It's really interesting because we're talking, it's been 12 years now that I've been in diaspora. And at times you see a lot of progress, right? Like I know that back then, before I came here, there was like a sense of, okay, hay que hice. And this is something that I have to commend to you and a lot of the people that stay back. And this is something, and I'm going to address diaspora now. But before I address completely diaspora, I'm going to start by implicating us. The work that activists and artists and scholars and people that are back in the DR doing is monumental. We have a privilege, which is complicated out here. We'll talk about that, but we have a privilege of, we can be this vocal and our livelihoods are not going to be taken away from us. Because we have, and a lot of the people that are first generation know that. If you're vocal, you lose jobs, your family loses jobs, and your physical well-being can be compromised completely. So thank you, Ruth. I think, and I am really grateful for the DSI offering this space, because the thing is that it comes to a point that I'm always like, will it come that day where like there's a physical, more than a physical ending of a life in the DR for people to be like, oh shit, it's really bad, I guess, right? Pero bueno, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I was trying to look at the terminology. I am first generation. I've been here for 12 years. And this presentation that I'm going to do, it's just like quickly some thoughts, observations, and the possibilities within like our contemporary Dominican diaspora. I'm going to be engaging mostly first generation and also the possibilities with second and third generation Dominicans here. When we're talking about transnational dialogues in regard to freedom of speech, be it academic, intellectual, but also in the public space. And we did talk a little bit about like also thinking about social media platforms as like public space. But also thinking about here in the United States and the current status quo with censorship in academic spaces, in the public opinion and media. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is a conversation. I want to think with you and be in conversation with you. Because also like this is not necessarily my research focus, but it's related to it. In my research right now, doctoral research, I am looking at what are the solidarities, resistance, and rebellions that Dominicans, activists and artists back in the island here in diaspora, New York City, New Jersey, engage and push back against this racist, cis heteropatriarchal construction of Dominicanidad, which is the one that is highly circulated. And we're like, that is being Dominican. But as Ruth said, it has been contested all the time. And we have a lot of scholars who have been engaging with this. We think about like Gloria Garcia Peña and her work. Like the thing is that these narratives have been silenced and have been occulted through this whole construction of this like Hispanic Dominicanness, right? So thinking about that, I want to push us to think about how we're implicated in this construction, even though we're out here, even though we might not be first generation Dominicans. So of course, let's start with numbers about Dominicans out here. So currently immigrants from the Dominican Republic are the 4th largest Hispanic migratory group in the US. And this is recent numbers from 2021. So we are right now at 1.9 millions, Dominican living in the US in diaspora. Just so we understand, Santo Domingo is around that like density. So this means, and also New York City, 700,000. And this is numbers from 2020. So all of this movement has been in the last 30 years, over 14% of our population has come here. So 14% of Dominican population left the country in the last 30 years. So what does that mean? Even if we have been here for generations, we know that we're now like maybe like mostly 4th, 5th generations right now. Maybe you know more than me with that.
Depends when the first ones came.
But like the more cohesive groups, right? Like we're thinking about these ones that we see in our neighborhoods around here. We are still having a lot of people that are coming into this place. And not only that, as you might know, if you're Dominican, and also if you're first generation, there's a constant communication. The transnational dialogues that we have, be it through, we have family back home, we send back remittances, we go back every summer, or we go for the holidays. There is this symbiotic back and forth that we're engaging in. So, and of course, going back to the remittances, this is something that it's not highly circulated because of course we're presented as the Dominican Republic as this land of service, but our remittances, specifically from New York City, 2020 was up to 8 billion that we sent to the Dominican Republic. And this is only accounting for what is official remittances. That is not counting for La Caja or Lo Cambumbo, or whenever you bring your maleta. So these are, we are a pillar of the economy because people back in the Dominican Republic in its majority cannot sustain themselves with the cost of living and what is the basic income. So we as diaspora have this burden, right? And we don't think about it, it's normalized. Of course, most of the generations that just come here, it's escaping this idea, like, como se dice, economical refugees. We cannot make enough money back home. And specifically if you are like from the rural areas and understanding that right now Santo Domingo I think it was just released, is the second most expensive city in Latin America, or the first one
Yep.
to rent. So what does that mean? We're gonna have more numbers coming in. I am just bringing all of this is because understanding the fact that we move out because of economic reason, we move out and are then choosing like, okay, systemic oppression over there versus systemic oppression here, because of course Dominicans are living in a grand majority in New York City under poverty line. We have a lot of I think 40% of Dominicans working in the service industry. You're choosing a different kind of oppression because you're a recent immigrant, with the language issue sometimes, and also being racialized out here. And then you are the pillar for your family back home. And this is something that I want to invite, maybe later we can talk about. Like, why aren't we as diasporic subjects that are sustaining an economy back home organizing around this? Like, how aren't we really thinking about, like, what does it mean that we leave because we cannot make enough money? We come out here and we just make a little bit enough, so we have to send back home. And the Dominican government uses us as pawns around this. So, no sé, vamos a pensar ahorita de eso. So, as I said, this is a conversation that's more focusing on diasporic needs. So, and now going into the freedom, I didn't put the timer, sorry. So thinking about what does it mean being out here as a diasporic subject? I want to engage specifically in the last 10 years. I know that we might not be thinking about Dominicans in solidarity specifically if we're thinking like second generation, but as someone who has been organizing out here, and I'm happy to see some of the people that I organize with here in diaspora, there has been echoes of what happens in the Dominican Republic and how we echo out here and engage and try to activate politically the diaspora, be it by informing them about what is happening back home, how can you support, and also understanding the privilege that we have of just speaking about it and not, again, losing our livelihoods by engaging in these conversations. So personally, I've been an organization around matters of femicide, reproductive rights, anti-racism, and corruption back home. So we also know, and there's the electoral politics part here. We are really, como se dice, fortunate as a diaspora that we can hold elections out here. And I'm not going to get into the messiness of electoral politics, but still, like, we have a lot of voters that are mobilized politically. So I want to, like, focusing on the grassroots organizing and mobilizing and the solidarities that are presented through scholars and artists here in the US. We need to think about, okay, what are the freedoms that we have, but then how the echoes of repression show up here. So, of course, if you have been active in some of the mobilizations, larger mobilizations that have happened here in diaspora, there was a big one in 2012 against corruption, and that was during Danilo's puppet years in government. So that was pretty big one. It was in Times Square, I think November. Then we had one big one in February 2020, just before all hell broke loose with the pandemic. And these were thousands of Dominicans taking over Broadway from, I think, 178 up to 181st Street and spilling over. And unfortunately, like, I don't have a projector, but one of the things that it was really interesting seeing in those protests about corruption was a lot of the people holding the signs, connecting how they are economic refugees out here. Like, I am out here, I'm an immigrant because of you back there being corrupt. So there's an awareness. I didn't ask them if they're like recent immigrants, if they're like second generation, but they understand their condition of immigration here because of the corruption and how democracy fails back in the Dominican Republic. So there's no countering to these manifestations. Usually there's a unity, everyone is there. Like, if we can rally around something, is the Dominican government is corrupt. It doesn't matter who is on top. So, and the other ones with the the epidemic of femicides in the Dominican Republic, also usually there's no countering, there's solidarity. The issues and tensions usually start showing up, and a little degree is whenever we're talking rallying around reproductive rights or las tres causales, you start having like a little bit of tension, right? You have people that are going to, it has happened to us that all of a sudden there's a group in front counter protesting our rights. And this is in diaspora, but usually it's really low stakes. I think it even makes it more spicy, which is a privilege for us, right? Like, we don't think that our bodies are in the line, but the moment everything changes is whenever we address racism and anti-Haitianism back in the Dominican Republic. So there's a clear fracture. First, we see the gender, right? Like, if we're talking and addressing gender and women's and feminized bodies, liberty to control themselves and have like agency over their bodies, it's like, okay, we start like falling apart. The moment race then it's inserted, that's it. And it's incredible because La Antigua Orden Dominicana is really active out here as well. And they will mobilize and circulate whatever activity is happening that might have any tone of anti-Dominicano, because of course, you being someone who is standing an anti-racist positionality, for them is attacking Dominicanidad.
Right.
And this is something that, while I will say, we have made, I've been participating with other groups of Dominicans and solidarity protests with Haitian comrades out here. It is interesting because, of course, NYPD also like sucks, but you will see that they will make sure they cannot touch us. So there's a different type of, like, okay, you stand there and you stand here. Yet this, you will see them recording everyone. And this is where the public space extending into social media platforms gets engaged. Sure, here maybe I am protected to a certain degree, yet I've had people on Instagram literally knowing and telling me, I know where you live. And I will tell someone to just like hold you in the corner. And this is something that they will circulate it in social media and they will dox people. The most recent one was with Lisi George Griffin, the student that was at Columbia and confronted Abinader. The way that she was doxed was, and just for context, doxing is whenever you give personal information, not personal identifying, but just like address, you give information where they live or
Your
what
image.
Pardon?
Your face, your image.
Your face, just circulating
Identity.
in the internet for harassment.
Mhm.
So the fact that even though she's protected, they are protected here in the United States, once it goes to social platforms with Dominican Twitter or whatever Twitter sphere you're in, you get harassed. And there's a really gray line about like, how do you tackle that type of persecution and targeting. La cosa que, and we have seen that also, talking back, like Gloria Garcia Peña keeps being bombarded and como se dice, Zoom bombarded whenever she has presentations. The last one, I think it was during the Dominican Studies Conference. We have people calling online, literally just putting like, these are the Dominican scholars that should not be allowed.
The
into
traitors to
other-
the country.
The traitors, exacto. So these are things that there's limitations of the protection. And of course, I feel that we are safe in other ways, yet the tensions and the persecution that happens in the Dominican Republic is such that diasporic movement also comes here, right? The good comes here, but also the bad echoes back. And while we might think that the United States as a democracy, we understand, and we Dominicans have understood also how the system fails you constantly. The police is not to protect, it's not going to be there to protect us. And yeah, we're seeing now with Palestine what is happening, like who gets silenced, who gets a platform, what is deemed violent. And whenever we talk about freedom of expression, especially like I'm talking from someone who is right now at Cornell, we protect far right speech that actually targets the lives of people of color. And those calls that might be for decolonization are deemed violent, even if it's something that is not calling for physical. So it's something, whenever we talk about freedom of speech, we need to really sit down and think whose speech is being platformed, whose speech is being protected. And being in the United States does grant us some safety from that Dominican persecution, but we have a whole different monster here. So just to like close down on my exposition, I just wanted to bring back ideas of what could be our position, because Dominicans in diaspora have their own issues. We have, my friends, I worked with local electoral politics, and we are getting run over, to not use my French. And we need to be seeing like how even in diaspora we're so overwhelmed that we can't seem to organize around issues that are housing. We're getting gentrified. We're getting pushed out of our neighborhoods. We are living in food deserts. There's no health. There's no security. And then not only that, within a diasporic community, we are then having this burden, economic burden back home, which is a privilege to have. Yet we're not mobilizing around the oppressions we're feeling here. Necessarily, there's people mobilizing, and I'm sorry, it's not as pervasive the organization that should be happening in our communities. Because I do have to say there's a lot of people working here in the Heights, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, that are our people, but we need to be more diligent and working across each other and coming in intersections. And if we're like first generation too, how do we lend a hand and como se dice, actively be in solidarity with each other and shut these desgraciados down? I don't know how to translate desgraciado.
Amazing. If I may interject before you, it might be argued, if we're talking here about freedom of speech and intellectual freedom, I don't think there's much intellectual stuff about the alt-right nationalist groups, but they are also subjects to this right of expressing themselves. So
Claro.
What is the difference? So if we're claiming to be able and feel safe and feel free to express our discontent, or express our opposition, express our desire for a change in the paradigm or a deep transformation of our society, then we must grant that right to them as well. The thing is that nobody is saying that they cannot express themselves. They can organize and they can put their ideas out there in the public scope, both the internet and in public spaces. No feminist or anti-racist or human rights defender shows up in Antigua Orden Dominicana's activities to boycott or assault or be violent.
Mhm.
Also, we must consider hate speech. Hate speech, like freedom of expression, does not cover hate speech,
Exactly.
especially when it mobilizes the masses to, and it has very real, tangible consequences in the lives of people. These ideas that they put out there have mobilized good everyday Dominicans, because here's the thing, this is not about they're the bad ones and we're the good ones. These ideas that are being put out there are modeling the minds of our young people and are exacerbating the bias of our old people.
Exactly.
And so here's when you see things like what happened in Pedernales, that a bunch of everyday good Dominicans that have people that love them, that are decent human beings that work and provide for their families, to organize and destroy a Haitian community and burn their houses down and kick them out. These ideas make decent people into criminals. And this is how we have to go carefully about it. These ideas is what made that, I think 7 or 8 years ago, we had a Haitian immigrant lynched in the city of Santiago, literally hung from a public park, in a tree in a public park.
Yeah.
This is what's making a lot of underage children disappear when they are taken in these raids in immigration. This is what is allowing everyday people that don't mean no harm to become mobiles, to become arms of these arms and hands that enact violence against other human beings. So I think that's the danger. Just wanted to point that out.
There was one topic that you both have been touching on, and that has been important for us also as we were thinking about this 13 Scholar program here, and we got a lot of questions about the Dominican Republic being a democracy, and if the DR is a democracy, then why is there a need even for such a program, right? And so we had to explain to a lot of people that the idea of this program is it's not so much to denounce or to say that, oh, the DR is not democracy, right? But to first maybe refine a little bit how we think about democracy and specifically engage in the same kind of conversation we're having tonight about the quality of this democracy. So maybe a question for you both is like to some extent, like how much infringement on such fundamental rights as freedom of speech, academic freedom, intellectual freedom, as you have been commenting, can we tolerate until we continue to accept that we are indeed living in a democracy? And this is, by the way, a question that is important for the Dominican Republic, but particularly for the US as well. I mean, I think that we're seeing this when you have authors like Toni Morrison being banned from school libraries in some states in this country. I think that we are definitely do not live in a country that can give lessons to others.
Yes.
So I don't know what that inspires.
Yeah, actually, and this is something I want to start. I'm going to start a little bit with the DR and then move to the USA. Yeah, something with the whole infringement of the democracy and stuff. If we go back to the DR, and I wanted to look for the specifics of when this was instated. So my Dominicans here that have lived back home, most of you have heard about like who's the father of democracy in the Dominican Republic, which is Joaquin Balaguer. Out here, most of us understand Balaguer as this tyrant. He was actually a dictator, and he killed a whole generation of intellectuals and activists and scholars that were against this perpetuation of a tyranny that he was first a puppet of Trujillo. And the fact that this man, it was in 2003 actually, I thought it was Leonel, but it was Hipólito Mejia who made it into like the Senate passed a law to recognize Joaquin Balaguer as the father of Dominican democracy. Like the fact that we understand ourselves as a democracy, starting from tyranny, lets you understand what is the perpetuation of the democracies that the Dominican imaginary projects and is trying to emulate. So we have, again, it's not that the memory is not there. We have people actively engaging in the decolonial and anti-racist memory in the Dominican Republic. It's just that because there's no circulation of these narratives, there's no recognition of these narratives, you happen to have stuff like the Metro of Santo Domingo having a Balaguer who killed Aminabel,
The station.
the station. So you have the killer, and then you have Aminabel, and then you have Mamatingo. You have exactly. So you have no actual understanding, and you can place a national, someone who you could understand as a national hero or someone that has fought for the land rights, Mamatingo, or Aminabel for freedom of speech and prensa, press, there you go. Sorry, Spanglish. Next to a tyrant, and be okay with that. So what does that mean? How do we, can we understand that the Dominican Republic, back to what you said, the critical thinking, we cannot have critical thinking if we don't even give the whole story for people to judge and understand and draw the lines again, like with each other. So that is going to the DR. Now, like, I'm gonna come to this place where I think that democracy, it's really interesting for me being in the United States. There's this understanding that politics and democracy is enacted every 4 years, whenever you go to the ballot. And something that we have to understand is that not only if you have a system that does not allow for the majority of the people being represented, even in that electoral process, what is this about a democracy? You have so many things, and I'm gonna not go into the electoral that much, but we already have this understanding that it's really squared about, like, okay, democracy gets enacted this way, and this is what assures that all of our rights are going to be preserved. But then we understand that to the federal level and then the state level, all the time, the majority is not represented. We are actively seeing people being silenced, being sidelined. And the reality is that the United States champions itself as the center of the universe.
Yes.
But we are so behind. The fact that healthcare is not even a right. The fact that we don't have the little things that we have been bought with blood. And constantly get backtracked, thinking Roe v. Wade. What does that mean? So we're constantly in this battle for rights that might not go, como se dice, might not be sustained in the next 10 years, next 20 years. And it's not a guarantee. So are we, so what does that mean for us out here when we look at the Dominican Republic? It's like, oh my God, it's so bad back there.
So backwards.
It's so backwards, but out here we're like, hey, you had abortion was a right, not anymore, deuces. So so I think that there's something that we need, and I think a lot of people are finally understanding, those that didn't understand, because everyone has been, people know that the United States is a charade. as a democracy as well. And we need to actively also be engaging in this conversation and how to disband this idea that this is perfect. And while we have dialogues with the Dominican Republic that is in other ways messed up, we need to look ourselves in the mirror as well.
No, I agree, and que tú no deja, how we say in Spanish, when we look up to US as a democracy, as a country, in the Dominican Republic. Earlier, we were talking with Pierre, and he was posing this idea of, are we sliding back? Are we going backwards? But addressing your argument there, are we going backwards, or are we just still the same and just the names of the flavors change? You know, because in Dominican Republic, we still call on Trujillo. Many of the comments that we have is calling for dictatorship. I think people are being conditioned, because this is with all due respect to our Dominicans brothers and sisters. It's not that Dominicans cannot think on their own, don't have the capacity of critical thinking. We have the capacity of critical thinking. We just don't have the enforcement of that. We don't have, that's not something that's rewarded or something that's stimulated or something that's built as necessary for a functioning human being. When you see our education system, the education system is built to shape citizenship.
Exactly.
And we are building exactly the citizenship that we want to have. Because a disinformed or misinformed community, people, el pueblo, when it's misinformed, is easy to control.
Yes.
So as long as it serves the power and the elites in the Dominican Republic to keep us misinformed and keep us fighting disenfranchised communities with disenfranchised communities, they're still going to salirse con la suya, how we say in Spanish. They're gonna win. And the fact is that they're becoming so loud and so aggressive because these new generations, all due respect to the trailblazers and those humongous shoulders that we're standing on in their day, right? And the work that they did prepared the way, the path for us today. With all the respect to their trajectories, it has benefited us, the internet, and that everybody is communicating and the ideas spread more easily. That you don't need to be a journalist to express your opinion. You can go to Twitter and then you have your público, you know? And we have had that advantage, disadvantage, that in this generation, these ideas like reach farther audiences. And I think we have to give props to all the communitary, non-academic work that's being done in the Dominican Republic to do that. Like, knowledge is not only built in the academias, and this is something that we vindicate in our activist work. Everybody is subject of knowledge and everybody is subject of culture. The thing is how we balance the voices that are showcased or not. That being said, the subalternas voices, the subaltern voices are not the ones that are going to be put out there. So we have to rompebrazo to put our ideas out there and not let ourselves be intimidated, although we're in the face of danger every day, just for thinking the way we think.
In interest of time, because it's already 8 p.m. I thought maybe we could ask if people have questions in the audience.
For sure.
Or reactions or comments. Or disagreements, which would be even more interesting.
Yeah.
Get back.
Oh,
You know?
no, we'll get to the other question after. Go ahead.
Okay. I know her. I just wanted to piggyback what you said, right? So the Dominican Republic having a great majority of our people living here in the US, and how in the DR we look up to the US. And if you see what's happening here and how being a democracy and going back to Black racism, how here is also punished. When Dominicans see that, then for them it's like, well, if we're doing what Americans are doing, then we're doing it right.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So you see that being repeated, not only the Dominican Republic, but we have many other countries in Latin America, if you want to call it that way, that are doing that. And is sad to use a very poor word to use, that this is what we're following.
Mhm.
Right, so we want to portray this community of European descendants that are progressive and looking towards the Greek democracy and fighting. But what we're really doing is just emulating countries that are actually not being progressive, like the US.
Imperialist.
Mhm.
So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Exactly.
You're 1.7 million, sorry, is that correct?
1.7, no, 1.9 million out here.
Oh, Dominican.
I
Republic?
think it's more,
It's
but
3 million almost.
This is 2021. This is
It's almost
2021.
3 million
So-
people here.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. I'm gonna talk in Spanish because my English is still evolving. I'm always trying to find a hope in all of this. Because this is the only way I can continue with my work and with everybody. I'm a Minera. I'm from Los Minas, San Lorenzo de los Negros Minas, Barrio Cimarrón, República Dominicana, uno de los primeros barrios Cimarrón, one of the first maroon hoods in the Dominican Republic, San Lorenzo de los Negros Minas. We have this feeling of orgullo minero, proudness of orgullo. But we don't have the information about de dónde viene ese orgullo. We have the feeling. No matter how many one tourist or anybody can take this from our hearts, out from our hearts. And when I found the information here in New York, cuando a mis 34 years, 34 años de edad, I found the information about Los Minas, about Padre Home, and about how this orgullo minero, it's something based in historical realities.
Mm.
So if Dominicans, Black Dominicans especially, got the information, do you think, or you have the hope? I got it. Yo la tengo. If we have the information, especially in those terms, like Padre Home, it was not, no fue un tipo por ahí, no. Él mató a su amo y creó una región.
Right.
¿Me entiendes? Eso es, this is a fucking shit, right?
Yeah.
You know? And I get proud immediately.
Mhm.
And I say, okay, this proudness, that base, tiene base. So you think if we continue with this, especially with Mamá Tingo, with La Negra del Hospital, with all the stories we have, real stories we have, and about Black people being the center and leaders and people who make change. You think Dominicans can change our heart, nuestro corazón, and nuestra mente?
I'm betting on it. I am betting on it. The fact that we don't speak on enslavement, and in this regard, I believe that the US is mirroring US and not the other way around, is now that your critical race theory and your history books are being banned and just put apart, they're being destroyed and the narrative is completely being changed. That's something that we've always experienced in the DR. There's almost complete silence regarding the history of our African ancestors. And from the natives, we only learn los cinco cacicazgos, basically. That's all we get. So, but this is intentional in everywhere, not only in DR, in the US, everywhere. The not portraying the colonizers or the colonization process as the violent process as it was, and enslavement serves the elites and serves the power. If there's not a problem then why should we think about solutions? This is regarding history learning in Dominican Republic and history teaching in Dominican Republic, and also racism as a whole. Like we say, we don't have race. If we don't have race, there cannot be racism. So by deleting the problem, we don't seek for answers. So as long as we don't know our historical background, for example, enslavement, because if we knew about enslavement, we would know Sebastián Lemba, we would know La Negra del Hospital, we would know the founder of Los Minas, and we would know so many other stories of resistance and liberation. But because enslavement is not even a problem, it's not even regarded and celebrated, Joaquín Balaguer in La Isla del Revés says that slavery was mild and that enslaved people and masters were friendly with each other. Like that kind of erasure prevents us, hold us from learning the power that we hold as Black people. And so this is why I insist, and this is why I believe that everything begins with information. This is why I also studied anthropology, because I needed to understand why. Like why this happens. If we understand why, if we have a broader perspective of what's going on, perhaps we can see solutions. Perhaps we can acquire tools to confront these systems and the consequences of these systems in these narratives, because this is not talk. This is not un paquito. This is shaping our lives every day.
And I think, I will just expand a little bit on that. Like, we have been educated to be this way. The Dominican, like, it's been a project since colonization for people to not address this thing, and for Dominicans to be indoctrinated and enact the dream of the colonizer. That is not their dream. So the moment that we start addressing and actually educating, and not necessarily through, because it was going to take time for a system to be reshaped or dismantled and rebuilt to make the center these narratives. We need to continue projects like that, like Afrohistoria. We need to be continuing dialogue with each other, having panels like this, talking to the children. Because the thing is that we will not, the state doesn't want us to be liberated. The state doesn't want you to know why you're proud of being a Lominera. Fuck no, porque en el momento que tú lo sabes, tú tienes el poder. And that's what they're afraid of. So I do believe that the moment that we start, and I have seen already the change. As we said, like our generation and the younglings, the Gen Zs, I love them. Y'all are my heroes, because they're like, okay, we got these tools, let's learn, let's use them, and let's circulate the stories that are being kept away from us. Así que nada, vamos a TikTok. Oh my God.
Yeah, this expresses itself so, it's so in our face all the time that it has become part of our normalcy, part of lo normal, part of la vida. But it's amazing how many afros and curly hairs I see in this. 12 years ago, no afros en la calle, mi amor. No, and this is us. This is not something that we can, this is something that I say on the Twitter. I cannot wake up today and be like, I'm gonna be white today. You know, I feel like being white, being more palatable, being trigueñita, being tener una nariz. We cannot do that. So these things makes us, as you were addressing pride, we are taught shame on our hair, on our bodies from very early stages of life. Like I learned racism and I didn't have to go to no school, no taller, for people to explain that I was not adequate for the Dominican average.
Exactly.
You know, that I needed to do more, that I needed to straighten my hair, that I needed to massage my nose, make it thinner, that my skin needed to be lighter. You know, you don't need to go to academia to learn that. No, that's in our midst. So pride is so important. But we can only take pride when we have information and when we have the story. So thank you so much for that. We had 3 hands.
Oh, you decide.
Yo, no.
I think you had raised your hand first.
Yeah, I just want to like add to that, the prior conversation and the aspect of it. It's like how the colonial legacy is just like taught us on like hiding ourselves. And if I like figuring out and finding these informations that bring pride to us, definitely would like give us the tools to really get rid of that shame and self-hate and lack of self-identity that has been lost through the gaps of book of history now. But I wanted to ask, like, I've been here in the diaspora for a long time, and as you mentioned earlier, there's been legal procedures being against the ultra-right movement in the Dominican Republic, but not necessarily has been any success on those processes. So us in diaspora, that we somehow do have some space and have some like leverage to bring awareness to the thing. Can you provide any advice or any like ways that we can like contribute and create more conscious like of what this hatred is being perpetrated and violence is being perpetrated to our own community back home?
Is that for me? Okay, about that?
For you. Like for you in the sense, because you know, like you're going back. I mean, we all somehow dream going back home, no? But as we still stay here and we're here, that I believe we can become an, like an echo, a megaphone for what is happening out there, and actually, like, try to make a difference and get like the state to actually listen, because we all know the Dominican government cares about the international appearance.
I think that's the key. Honestly, there's many ways of cross collaboration and solidarity, and I think it's already happening. Many of us feel backed up and supported. Me personally, before everything that happened to me, I went through a serious health event, and my diasporic friends that I knew could manage sustained me when my health insurance didn't pan out. So there's a lot of cross collaboration, and I think also that element of the international pressure, because you represent a financial power in the Dominican Republic. This is not to say that all of you agree. Nobody, there's no society that 100% everybody agrees on everybody is that's a national chimera, like a fantasy. Never happens. Like there's always confronting and competing interests in society. But I think there's a generation that you can leverage your monies to support causes that are worth it. Also your votes. Your votes also can tilt the scale in the Dominican Republic.
So I want to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
Really sorry, because I think
Go ahead.
it hasn't come up yet, and I think it's a big issue in the Dominican Republic, and it has, like I said, the role of political parties in the Dominican Republic, because I think when we talk about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, we're talking about a state or an institution that's going to foster that, like foster the space for someone to express themselves freely and safely. And I feel that one of the biggest obstacles in the Dominican Republic is that there are no political options when we want change. And so, and I think that's why I really do value the community organizers and kind of from the ground up, creating awareness and all of these things, I think has its value. But I think also we need to push on the idea of why it is that the political parties in the Dominican Republic are the strong ones are the same. Like, I don't see any ideological difference.
No.
Like if I'm
There's
if I'm going to
names.
go vote, I don't
It's the
even know
colors.
who I want to vote for, because it's all the same.
Yeah.
And I see that as a huge obstacle, and I kind of want to throw that at you, Ruth, who's been there for the last, I don't know,
All my life.
15 years,
All my life.
being an activist. If you've seen a difference con el PLD, then el PRM, and if you haven't, I just want to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, with pleasure. I've lived my entire life in the Dominican Republic. This is the first time that I live abroad for a long period of time. So, not that my family was very involved with politics or particularly politics like that. But as you say, what we've been seeing, the younger generations or mid generation, porque ya no una señora mayor, is that there's no difference. The same voices, regardless of who's in power at the moment, the same people always get the shorter stick. That's how you say it in English, well, the shorter of the sticks, right? We always are the people that are more dispossessed, more disenfranchised. And this provokes a lot of sadness in me, because many Dominicans that align with these voices are also being exploited. And let me say this personally, I do not have a lot of faith in institutions, because in my entire life, that's what I've seen. So, and this is why it's important. Is grassroots organizations are important, and the change from the bottom up, because from the top down, it's not going to happen. And in my 30-some years of life on earth, you did the math. I haven't seen any like the change in parties have not made a great difference in the way of life, in the lifestyles, in the, ¿cómo se dice? Quality of life, in the quality of life of the people around me. We have become masters of sustaining each other. And this is an ancestral heritage. Eurocentric logics are inherently individualistic.
Exactly.
Yes.
We have survived in the DR, and this is something that I always say in the tours also, we're magic. We're magic. Like, I don't know how we do it.
For real.
I don't know how we do it, because when the cost of life is $800 and the base income is $200, and you have a family of 3, a family of 4, you have to pay bills, you have to pay rent, you have to pay transport, and you have a very, you live in these conditions, and they continue to do so. And we continue to survive, also thrive, also enjoy life, despite of the circumstances. I am happy that we have more progressive people that are forming political parties. Perhaps we could see a difference in some of the years, in the upcoming years. But so far is corporate greed, corruption, and this is why I call on my alt-right nationalist peers. Where is your nationalism when our natural resources are being given to international capital? Where's your defense of the land in the resort and touristic industry when they are forbidding us from accessing our beaches, our mountains, our rivers? Where's your defense of country there?
Yeah.
Or is it that your defense of country can only be against Haitians?
Right.
That's the only patria que existe.
Exactly.
A white and Dominican identity.
Sin agua, sin río.
Right. Without air, do you know?
Without air, yeah.
How, like, without basic guarantees of life, like, and this is why I'm surprised. Like, to me, there's a connection to colonization time and today. Like, why are you claiming to the people that have their food on your neck? Why are you defending people that have their food on your neck? Like, delincuentes might steal your phone in the DR because there's not public safety, or might even stab you or murder you. But what about those mass murderers in the state that pillage state money, state that can be directed to better education, money that can be directed to healthcare for everybody, for safer infrastructure? You heard what happened last week in the DR with the floods. 9 innocent people, like it's plus 30, but due to infrastructure, imagine. So it's like our thing with the white collar, blue collar kind of criminal, and it's also a continuum of criminalizing Black bodies, Black disenfranchised bodies. Let me leave it like that because we have more questions. ¿Verdad?
Yeah, you and I are going to have a little conversation about institutions and about community organizing in Europe, but we'll keep that for another day.
Yeah, I would love to.
I know that we have online questions. I just want to take a couple of those before we come back to the room.
So I'll read the first couple of ones one at a time. The first one is from Professor Garcia Peña, so I'll try to summarize.
A little louder, please.
Sorry?
A little louder,
Yeah,
please.
great. So, the professor says, just last month, on the same week, I had a talk interrupted by Dominican nationalists in Massachusetts and had to be escorted out to safety by officers and uninvited from another for condemning the genocide of Palestinians. So if I may, I want to say a word of caution about the illusion of safety in the US for dissident scholars, particularly in this moment. I also wanted to ask your thoughts on the question of complicity. Ruth mentioned how difficult it is for people to put themselves at risk in the Dominican Republic for fear of losing their livelihood, which is a real and tangible fear, and not just in the US. So how do we move forward in a democracy that is not a democracy and with the widespread complicity of those who are supposed to be upholding?
You want to throw the second question in the mix and then
I didn't
we'll see
write
what
down
we
this
do with
question.
those?
Great.
So.
The second question refers to Gina's point on solidarity between Dominicans in the Dominican Republic and the diaspora. And so this attendee asked, can you talk about the importance of learning critical history for those of us who are second generation, born in the United States, to nurture that solidarity?
All right, you're gonna have to remind me the question of Gloria porque me quedé con la última. So I'm gonna start by the last question. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity of volunteering in George Washington High School here in New York City with an after-school program. The after-school program was actually in critical analysis of history. And we addressed the history of African people beyond enslavement. Because for us in the Caribbean and Latin America, the history of people of African descent begins with enslavement, but in the motherland it doesn't. And we don't have that perspective. We don't have like that view that Black people, African descent people were something other than slaves, which is a word that I don't like to use actually, enslaved people, I prefer. So I believe that it is paramount. It is paramount to learn history, to understand that history as a science is also biased, is also produced by people that have biases. And that history is also a tale. Like the historical documents that back up much of our of what is told in our textbooks and what is transmitted to us through education and academic spaces was told by the colonizers. And so it's up to us to rescue the memory and the work of our ancestors. We're not going to do that through books, sadly, because the right of reading and writing was denied to African enslaved people in the Americas. So we reached that stage of being able to record our tales in paper way later on we could. But you know, we have oral history, and we have the traditions that sustain our communities, spiritual traditions that talk about how we rebuilt, how our ancestors recreated their lives in these new spaces. And I think is if we don't know that, if we don't learn about their trajectories, not only as people subjected to enslavement, but people that fought against colonial regime and people that thrived against colonial regime, people that organized communities like Sebastián Lemba in when he rebelled in 1535, if I remember correctly. If we don't learn about the first successful recorded rebellion of enslaved people that happened in 1521, if we don't learn about this, we're losing a lot of richness and a lot of complexities in our story. We need multiplicity of perspectives to put this puzzle together. This is not to say that to disregard the work that historians have done, be that biased or not. This is not to disregard the historical records and archives. This is about reinterpreting them. with new perspective, with new eyes, considering the things that are not told, considering competing interests. I think it's a labor that we have in front of us, and that we all have to pitch in collectively to do.
Would you repeat the end of the first question?
Yeah, so the first question, the point is basically, the professor is asking about this question of complicity. Talking on, or referring to this point that was brought up about how it's difficult for people in the Dominican Republic and in the US to speak up and put themselves at risk. And also seeing that people who ascend to power, scholars and cultural producers, very quickly forget their democratic values. So how do we move, so this is a direct quote, so how do we move forward in a democracy that is not a democracy and with the widespread complicity of those who are supposed to be upholding?
Demanding deep transformations in our society. Like, these cannot be asked for. We cannot plead for it, sadly. Like, I think there's space for that. There's space for political correctness. There's space for going through the motions in the system. Because that's what we got. A lot of people say when they see our performances, pero váyanse pa Haití, pero váyanse pa Africa. Entonces, like we're at a time and at a space to speak about these issues. But no, I mean, we must work, there's work that's being done within institutions to make space for talks like this. Like, if we didn't have also that influence, more of us with critical thinking and with a desire of deep societal transformations in academic spaces and in public spaces and in politics, particularly politics anyway, then we would have less than we have now. So I think that has its role, but I don't think systemic change is possible porque los bomberos no se pisan la manguera. That's something that we say in Dominican Republic. It means la clase no se suicidan. Power is not going to give itself away, you know? So we must engage in demanding strongly and also being the change that we want to see. And I know that sounds a little corny and romantic, but because I went natural in my household, my sister and my mom also feel like it was okay to be natural. So I think be the change that you want to see. It's a starting point. And I actually didn't finish the previous question. I'm sorry. So I feel I had that opportunity of teaching in George Washington High School, where first generation students from high schools in Dominican Republic just had months living in the DR. So imagine if they don't teach us history like that has any kind of Afrocentric perspective in the DR, imagine in the US. So these students had a thirst of learning about who they were, what they're like, where could they place themselves in this new country where there's more identities, more cultural identities, or different complexities regarding identity here in the US. But we had the chance to bring the students back in a summer school program so they could learn about Native people in Ojo de Agua in collaboration with Museo Magua. And they got to learn about this joint rebellion and these joint processes of liberation of the natives along with the Africans in the territory. So I believe it is paramount for the kids that are now away from the motherland, away from La Isla. They need that extra connection, like, because imagínate, being at home, they didn't get it. Now in this more complex setting in the US, where less information they're going to have. So I believe that it is very important to bridge that gap with students, with young people that just migrated to the US. And I think we're undertaking that work through El Instituto Antropológico y Arqueológico Antillano that led this work, and we planned, like, with the right resources and funding, to continue to connect Dominican kids and young people from the diaspora to connect back with the land with a critical historical perspective.
I think we'll take one more in the room and then I think we'll have to call it quits. Go ahead.
So, I want to bring again, academic freedom, because it is, if we want to go to the origins, it is through superior academics that this whole idea of identity and racialized was developed. It was developed through law, to try to figure it out how the other was different. How can I oppress it? How can I justify this?
Yeah.
And that, whether their conscience or not, hasn't changed. I'm at NYU doing a second master's, and one of the things that I'm confronting right now is that they have an undiverse syllabus, and I have raised my concerns. I have raised them in class with faculty. I was silenced, and I keep fighting. I keep pushing because the readings that they give us are racist,
Yeah.
Yeah.
whether they're subtle or not, and I have literally a physical reaction to that. How can we think that things are gonna change if the people that are supposed to bring this change are not bringing them? So it is something that we have to hold the superior institutions accountable for.
Mhm.
Because they keep perpetrating this idea of the dominant narrative to be the ones that are only intellectual enough to talk about subjects
Yeah.
like this. So.
Yeah, so something to keep reminding, and I think like right now with the political situations that were happening and with the genocides across the world, because it's not only Palestine, and understanding how institutions specifically, we're thinking NYU, we're thinking Columbia, we're thinking Cornell, and all the Ivies, they're complicit with a lot of this dispossession, not only abroad, but also in the US when we're thinking about land grabbing. And also with gentrification, if we're looking at Colombia. So there's something that always when right now we think like, oh my God, the institution should be progressive. But whenever we see like for the civil rights movement, when we're thinking about back with apartheid, like the universities weren't on the right side of history. They have never been. They then go back 10 years later, and they're like, oh my God, we're gonna have this panel with all these people talking about this retrospectively. But in the moment when these tensions are happening, the institutions are the first ones that are going to silence the people that are dissenters and the people that are not complicit with their silencing and perpetuation of the violences. Because we need to understand that inherently the construction of these institutions, and I'm not implicating everyone that it's inside, I'm saying the construction of this structure is racist, is colonial, and it's imperialist, and doesn't see you and people of color and people from the global south as people. You're subjects to be studied, you're not objective, your histories are not part of the official history, you're a minor area of study, maybe, we'll give you funding someday. So then we think, the thing is that we need to keep pushing in these spaces. And I support organizing within the institutions. We need to also understand that it's going to take 10 years for them to actually go back and be like, oh my God, that was so bad. We're going to bring someone that looks like you now to make you feel good. So, and I think that Lorgia was like hinting at it. Garcia Peña, Professor Garcia Peña was hinting into this, right? Like, there's people that then, because you have the individuals that are minoritarian in these institutions, and they're used and pawned to be the ones that enforce the power.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that are going to tell you, like, it's not racist, this book. I look like you. So I think that we need to be really clear with this, and we need to hold each other accountable.
Yeah.
If we are in community, call ourselves in, and if not, call them out.
Yeah.
And it's okay, because the thing is that unfortunately, these institutions will let go. We know with NYU what happened with the law students, and we know I was also in NYU, and some other people here were at NYU, and we remember how racist it was. and I am light-skinned. So these are things that we need to understand, that we need to keep pushing, and whenever we feel that it's going wrong, we go to the side and we go to community. Because this is like, I'm not implicated in the Dominican studies, but like these buildings are not weren't meant for us. They're catching up with their colonial liturgy. And maybe one day we'll dismantle everything and do something cute.
Perhaps.
Can we just say?
Oh, it's in bioethics that has very little of that.
Okay. Anyway, Gina, you're an artist, and I would like to know, how do you navigate your spaces
As an
as an artist? Because we're talking about the diaspora, but you also have to live, right, as an artist. So you probably go into other areas where you're not as welcome, probably,
or
or understood, or.
no, I'm getting a PhD and people don't understand why am I doing this? I think it's artists, it's not.
Because institutions like museums, galleries, they're also like your
Oh.
ethics department constantly.
That I'm still did what? I would call it, no, I think, so that is the thing, all of these institutions have colonial legacies and support this. And actually, even like thinking with Patricia Encarnacion, who's here, we have to think that everything that has been edificado, like constructed from colonial times, is colonial and does not see us more than maybe as this token to be circulated. And some of us are more desirable than others because of our proximity to whiteness or our proximity to uphold the system and not dismantle it. So yeah, like there's a reason why, for example, in the Dominican Republic, I don't get exhibited in some places because of how I am outspoken in Anesia. But also here, there's places that they do not like me
Exactly.
because I am outspoken. And I know that cost me certain things that I'm willing to negotiate, because thankfully I have different skills. And even me, while I was part of the Department of Education here in New York City, at least over there, it's so difficult to fire you. So, so you know, like there's places where I will find my protection. But it's it's
Well,
okay.
You know, you don't encounter usually Latin scholarists, you don't encounter Latin curators as much as European or.
There's a huge front coming up.
It's coming up.
It's coming up,
Just
yes.
coming up, yes.
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 And some
Just
of them
about.
are not, all skin folk are not kinfolk, so it's fine,
Right.
like, you know,
Right, right,
what is representation?
right, right.
Right.
But, yeah, I think everywhere, you will find, if you're loud enough, people don't like it.
Right,
Yeah, but there's also a problem of economy throughout the artistic world anyway. For example, if you were to resell, if your work has to be resold, you won't get any royalties. Okay, that's number one, terrible. Number two, if you were to donate your art,
Oh, all the fun sisters?
if you want to have a tax refund, you'll only get it on the basic materials. If a Patricia Cisneros, the great collector, donates her work, she will get the full refund of her work, of the work that she bought.
That can be a whole book about how messy the art world is.
So not only do we have, you know, racial, but then we have economical.
yeah, there's a lot of isms to
Totally.
address.
The triangulation of evil.
La trifecta.
I think we're gonna have to leave it at that
Yes.
for tonight. Feel free to hang out here
Yeah.
and continue the conversation.
Yes.
But I think we'll call it quits for the official part of this programming.
Yes.
Thank you so much. everyone.
Thank you.
I saw you turning and I was like, whoa.